crotch controversy, and this one's a real wiener. Hi, I'm Mark Kelly, and welcome to the show. Well, Afghanistan is often billed as America's longest-running war, and that's not exactly true, because the war on drugs was officially declared 40 years ago. And today, an international panel that includes former heads of state, a former UN Secretary General, and global business mogul released a report on that war on drugs. And their conclusion? It's time to raise the white flag. The Global Commission on Drug Policy urged the world to face the facts. Consumption is up.
What we've learned is that the war on drugs has increased drug usage.
The consumption is not being reduced.
So are the number of people in prison on drug offenses, about 500,000 people in the U.S. alone.
It's filled our jails.
In the increasing number of people in jail is there in the statistics.
It's a financial black hole. The U.S. spends almost as much each year on the drug war as it does on education.
The amount of money being expended to stop the use of drugs within the framework of war on drugs is enormous. Billions and billions of dollars.
This society is spending $40 billion a year in fighting drugs. That is a lot of money.
In short, the Commission says the war on drugs has come to less than nothing.
And the results are very scarce.
And it's fueled organized crime worldwide.
The policy they have in place is not effective. It's a failure.
The one thing we cannot afford to do is to go on pretending that the war on drugs is working.
40 years of prohibition, tough sentencing, and foreign intervention, a policy people have died and killed for, and according to this group, it's a failure. Well, if the Commission's findings carry any weight, it begs the question, if we can't win this war, why can't we stop it and find a new strategy? Well, that question has dominated Ethan Nadelman's career for more than 15 years. He's considered by some America's point man on drug policy reform. He joins me now from New York. Ethan, thank you for talking to us. And tell me, how would you categorize the success of the war on drugs to date?
Well, I mean, there's no question that the global war on drugs has been a monstrous failure. The United Nations has estimated that the global black market in drugs probably is worth about $300 or $400 billion a year. It's the #1 source of funding for organized and unorganized criminals, for terrorists, for political criminals. You know, it's resulted in a massive spread of HIV/AIDS around the world, massive levels of corruption and violence. Look at Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America, Colombia, Afghanistan. I mean, quite frankly, more and more parts of the world are like Chicago during the days of Al Capone and alcohol prohibition times 50. And so I think more and more people are realizing it's time for a change. That's what the Global Commission was about today.
And you've been pushing for the relaxing of drug laws, even the legalization of some soft drugs for years. But do you really feel like anything has changed?
Well, remember, it's not just about legalization. I mean, there is a growing movement towards legalizing marijuana, cannabis. You see it in the United States, where there's been a dramatic shift in public opinion over the last 5 or 6 years, where a ballot initiative to legalize marijuana almost won last fall, and where there'll be more in the future. But you also see it in the Global Commission on Drug Policy that came out with its report today. Never before has such a distinguished group gone so far in its recommendations for changing drug policy. You had former presidents of Brazil and Colombia, of Switzerland, of Mexico. You had the current Prime Minister of Greece. You had Richard Branson. You had prominent foreign ministers from Scandinavia and elsewhere. I mean, that sort of thing did not exist before. You didn't have that kind of critical mass of highly respected former officials and some current officials saying enough is enough, it's time to change. And what those commission members know, and what I know, is that for every one of them with the guts to speak out, there are many, many more who feel the same way, yet don't feel that the time is quite right, safe for them to say it right now.
Well, you use the word guts, and I hear other people saying it takes courage. What do guts and courage have to do with reforming the war on drugs?
Well, let's face it. I mean, the global war on drugs over the last few decades has almost been like a global religion. And the global drug prohibition regime has been a form of orthodoxy, and in a way trying to challenge it, saying that the war on drugs is doing more harm than good, saying that it's time to think about legally regulating drugs like marijuana, saying things that we should be prescribing heroin and other drugs to addicts who can't quit by other means, saying that addiction should be primarily a health issue, not a criminal issue. All of those things just 10 or 20 years ago were regarded practically as heresy, certainly in my country and in many other parts of the world. So when these guys and these women stood up today and they say enough is enough, time for a change, that still takes guts. People think that if you say get smart on drugs, it's about getting soft on crime rather than getting smart on crime. There's still that tendency for politicians to get in this kind of knee-jerk mode. And quite frankly, Mark, you look at in your country, what you could see from this commission is a hearty endorsement of what political leadership in places like Vancouver and in Quebec are doing in terms of embracing harm reduction policies and decriminalization policies, and effectively a hearty criticism for the Harper administration in Ottawa. There's a government that seems to be deliberately moving in a backward direction in the face of all evidence to the contrary.
Ethan, you've been lobbying politicians for years, and I'm curious to know, do you find that politicians say one thing privately about the war on drugs, then turn around and say something very different in public?
Oh, totally. Look, with elected officials, you almost take that for granted, certainly at the national levels. Because lots of these people are smart enough to look at this thing and say, this doesn't work. But take one example. In the United States right now, 46% of Americans say it's time to make marijuana legal. It's over 50% among Democrats. It's well over 50% excuse me, among people under the age of 30. Other groups are a majority. And yet the number of politicians who will say that publicly is maybe 1 or 2%. Privately, the number who have whispered to me and to friends and colleagues and allies that, yes, I agree with you, I just can't say it yet, I'm running for election, those numbers are in the dozens, known to me personally, and in the hundreds in terms of people I've heard about.
But if you feel like there's this groundswell for change, yet nothing has changed in terms of the war itself, I wonder, is there a linchpin or a key person that needs to be convinced to make the change?
Well, there's no one linchpin. On the one hand, having this group of distinguished former presidents and prime ministers and foreign ministers and business people standing up and sort of like the little child who yells out, the emperor has, no clothes, that's to some extent what this group was doing. And when a group this prominent comes out with a report that is this clear in thinking and reaches this far in its recommendations, people take notice. This thing's getting media attention all around the world. But then on the other hand, you have an organization like Avaaz.org, which has a global membership of 5 or 10 million people who campaign on different issues, and they're going to hand a list, a petition, with something like 700,000 signatures on it to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon of the UN tomorrow, calling for an opening of the debate and a change in drug policy. And then it's about brave, state legislators, provincial leaders. And then it's about people who join the Parents Teachers Association and say we need a different approach for educating our kids. And then it's about people in the professional worlds and people in the entertainment world all saying enough is enough. We have to stop banging our heads against the wall in support of a drug war that has so obviously failed, and we need to have the guts to move in a new direction. So there is no one linchpin. It's going to be many players playing different roles.
Ethan Nadelmann, thanks so much for speaking with me today. I appreciate this.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much.
Marijuana is the most widely used drug in the world, and according to one report, North Americans use it more than anyone else. Back in 2008, 10% of those aged 15 to 64 said they had used marijuana in the past year. That's almost 30 million people. That's not all. North America was also #1 for cocaine use. 2% said they used the drug in the past year. That's more than 6 million people. Well, as you probably have heard, the Conservative government is vowing to crack down on drug crime with new legislation, and it's promising to pass within its first 100 days in office, and now it's one day closer to that deadline. Reshmi Nair has the latest on the first day of the new parliament and some new information on a cyber attack on the government. Reshmi.
Mark, CBC News has obtained new documents tonight about a cyber attack on Parliament Hill earlier this year. At the time, the federal government said no sensitive information was stolen, but this email suggests some information was stolen and